Welcome to part 3 of my tux build. Here I will explain how I went by making the real garment right the way through to the finished and, I must say, fantastic looking garment. So my first task that I undertook before starting on the actual garment was to revise and add on any information or symbols and markings that I'd left out previously. The next thing I did was to slightly lengthen the arms. So I added on about 3 centimetre panels to each top and bottom sleeve to give me enough room to have it the same length as it was without finishing off the edges. So 3 centimetres meant I could then turn that up and hand stitch them down for a little hem, which was quite nice. So once that was done, which I was rather happy with, it was time to actually start putting pattern pieces to actual fabric. So I have my fabric laid out and the right sides facing outwards with the fabric folded. That enables you to cut two pieces, symmetrical pieces, simultaneously, rather than having to place your pattern piece on a single thickness of fabric, cut that out, and then do it all over again. Obviously, you will have a few pattern pieces like your welt pockets, one in particular at the top, which is just under your collar, which is one pattern piece, but it depends on each garment you make, but mostly you will have two pattern pieces which are mirror images of each other, which is why you fold your fabric in half. Next, it was time to overlock. So this is where you need to be a little bit sort of savvy with your overlocking. So basically, any overlocked edges, which is edges that you will see by the naked eye, you would overlock. Everything else that's encased in facings or collars and things like that, you wouldn't need to overlock because they're not going to be exposed and fray like a exposed seam would. And I personally like to overlock edges rather than do any other sort of seam finishing. I just find it simpler, easier and quicker to do. So once the pattern pieces were cut out, the next step is to add your markings. So all little notches where you would sandwich those markings together, meeting up to align your fabric pieces properly when you're sewing was my next step. That didn't take long at all, and then the next bit I had to do was to start sewing in with temporary stitches the markings for my welt pockets, the fold of the collar, any markings, including the back vents as well, any markings that I would need to know once I'm sewing and making up the garment where I need fabric to lie, to fold, anything like that. And on to the sewing. So I started off with my centre back seam, so stitching a 1.5 centimetres seam allowance, and then top stitching those seams down on either side to give me a nice, neat, professional finish. Then it was time to sew on my side panels to my now back panel, which was a simple matter of lining it up and sewing along the edge. Then it was the sleeves, sewing the two sleeve panels together, and then onto my welts. So the welts were simply sewn right sides together and then turned through, ironed flat, and then it was a case of putting on the binding and then attaching that to my jacket, which is where the side panel had to be sewn on in order to do that. So the welt pocket and the welt pocket by the collar were done. I then moved on to sewing the two front panel facings together, which would form part of your neckline at the back, as well as the front as well. It's a bit of a complicated pattern because you have to pivot at your collar to shoulder seam points and sew that in. So it kind of feels like you're going against your fabric, but it all works out in the end. In order to make that happen easier, you would do a line of stitching along each of your edge just within the seam allowance, and that stabilizes your fabric, which means you can snip your fabric into the corners, not cutting where you've sewn, and then that means you'll be able to flatten out your seams as you sew, which makes it a whole lot easier. Next, I dealt with the back vents. So where that happens, I simply sewed down the seam and then pivoted and along the diagonal sided edge, and then that gets folded underneath, and you would then top stitch on an angle where that vent at the top starts. But to make sure that I got the positions correct, I did a temporary stitch along that line in preparation, one, to stabilize it whilst I was going to work on it, and two, for the simple reason of knowing exactly where I was going to sew and stop. Then the next task to do was to sew in my sleeves. This is a bit of a task for any new sewer. You basically have to line your markings up in line with one, so you would put your sleeve markings in line with the relevant marks on the actual main garment, and then you would, with an arduous amount of pins, sort of, as you can see, I'm easing in the sleeve as I go. Now it looks like I would be sewing along there and I would have a whole load of ruckles, but what's actually happening is where my pin enters the fabric and exits, on that line is where the 1.5 centimetre seam allowance is, and that is perfectly flat between the two layers of fabric. It's eased in so that you basically fit the round edge into the flat edge. It's as simple as that, and it means that the sleeve lies nice and perfect for you. The final thing I had to do, and the bit I was dreading, was hand stitching all of my seams and edges down that needed to be. So that was the facings and any hem lines and hems on the sleeves as well, leaving me with just putting my buttonhole in and my button on, and then my finished garment, and I was a happy chappy in my summery, not so summery shorts. Hello all, so said jacket is completed. I have just spent the last 3 hours doing hand stitching all the way around on the facings and everywhere. Anyway, so excuse the shorts, it's rather hot. I am mostly, let's say about 99% happy with this jacket, this make. I'm very impressed. I thought it was going to be a bit more of a nightmare than it was. I am happy. I've got the button on, buttonhole done, the pockets are in with the nice sort of piping going on. All the piping around the edge here is showing. I've pressed the jacket. I've also steamed the collar into position. And I am a very, very happy chappy. So, that is the end of the make. I hope you enjoyed.